The security camera footage would later show that I hesitated for exactly 17 seconds before I knocked on the mahogany door. 17 seconds where I stood in that marble hallway, clutching my leather portfolio, wondering if I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life. I couldn't have known then that behind that door, someone had been watching those 17 seconds unfold on a monitor, studying the way I smoothed my burgundy blazer, the way I checked my reflection in the polished brass nameplate one final time. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I thought I was invisible. I thought I was just another candidate in a sea of hopefuls, another resume in a stack of applications. But Sebastian Ashford had been watching me from the moment I stepped onto his estate grounds that morning, and what happened next would change everything I thought I knew about power, about loyalty, and about the thin line between protection and obsession. The morning my life imploded started like any other Tuesday in downtown Portland. I was 26 years old, living in a studio apartment that smelled perpetually of the Indian restaurant downstairs, working as a junior marketing coordinator at Brennan Associates, and desperately trying to convince myself that this was just a stepping stone to something bigger. My alarm went off at 6:30, same as always, and I rolled out of bed with the practiced efficiency of someone who had perfected the art of getting ready in under 30 minutes. I remember standing in front of my tiny bathroom mirror, applying mascara with the kind of precision that comes from years of making every dollar count, when my phone buzzed against the sink. The text was from my supervisor, Patricia Brennan herself, which was unusual. Patricia rarely texted anyone below director level, and she certainly never texted at 7 in the morning. Need to see you in my office, first thing. That was it. No pleasantries, no context, just a summons that made my stomach drop to somewhere around my knees. I stared at the message, reading it 3 times as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less ominous. In the 2 years I'd worked at Brennan Associates, I'd never received a message like this. Patricia was the kind of woman who scheduled meetings weeks in advance, who believed in proper protocol and chain of command. I finished getting ready with shaking hands, choosing my most professional outfit, a navy dress that I'd bought on sale at Nordstrom Rack, paired with the one expensive pair of heels I owned. If I was walking into a trap, at least I'd look professional while doing it. The 20-minute bus ride to the office felt like an eternity, every red light stretching longer than it should have, every stop taking forever. Brennan Associates occupied 3 floors of a sleek glass building in the Pearl District, the kind of place that looked impressive from the outside but felt sterile and cold once you were inside. I'd always told myself that working here was a privilege, that I was lucky to have landed a position at such a prestigious firm straight out of college. But as I rode the elevator to the 14th floor that morning, watching the numbers climb with growing dread, I wondered if I'd been lying to myself all along. Patricia's office was a shrine to corporate success, all glass and chrome and certificates on the wall that proclaimed her various achievements. She was sitting behind her massive desk when I knocked, her silver hair pulled back in its usual severe bun, her expression unreadable. She was probably in her late 50s, but she carried herself with the kind of authority that made age irrelevant. I'd always admired her composure, her ability to command a room without raising her voice. "Sit down, Lorraine," she said without looking up from the documents spread across her desk. I noticed she didn't invite me to call her Patricia, as she usually did. That was the first sign that something was very, very wrong. I settled into the chair across from her desk, my hands folded in my lap, waiting. Patricia was a woman who believed in dramatic pauses, in letting silence do the work that words couldn't. But this silence felt different, heavier, like the air before a thunderstorm. "I'm going to cut straight to the point," she said finally, her eyes meeting mine for the first time since I'd entered the room. "We're letting you go." The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually felt my chest tighten, my breathing become shallow. "I'm sorry, what? Your position is being eliminated, effective immediately. We're restructuring the marketing department, and your role is no longer necessary." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, for the explanation that would make this make sense. But the Morrison campaign launches next week. The presentation I've been working on for 3 months will be handled by someone else. Patricia's voice was clipped, professional, devoid of any warmth. This isn't a reflection of your performance, Lorraine. It's simply a business decision. Business decision. The phrase hung in the air like a poison cloud. I'd heard it before, of course, in the countless articles about corporate layoffs and downsizing. But hearing it applied to my own life, to the job I'd poured my heart into for 2 years, felt surreal. I don't understand, I said, my voice sounding smaller than I intended. My last review was excellent. You said I was exceeding expectations. Patricia pushed a folder across the desk toward me. Your severance package. 2 weeks' pay, continuation of health benefits for 30 days, and a positive reference letter. It's quite generous, actually. Generous. I opened the folder with trembling hands, scanning the documents that would officially end my career at Brennan Associates. 2 weeks' pay. In a city where my studio apartment cost $1,800 a month, 2 weeks' pay was barely enough to cover rent, let alone food, utilities, and the student loan payments that had been following me around like a shadow since graduation. When? I asked. Now. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur. I signed the papers because I didn't know what else to do. Because the alternative was making a scene in front of a woman who clearly just wanted me gone. Patricia stood up, extended her hand for a brief, perfunctory handshake, and then I was walking out of her office for the last time. Security was waiting for me in the hallway, a kind-faced man named Marcus, who'd always said hello when he saw me in the lobby. He looked embarrassed as he accompanied me to my desk, standing awkwardly to the side while I packed my few personal belongings into a cardboard box. My coworkers watched from their cubicles, some with sympathy, others with the kind of relief that comes from knowing it wasn't them. I'm sorry, Miss Wood, Marcus said quietly as we waited for the elevator. This don't seem right. I managed a weak smile. Thank you, Marcus. That means a lot. The elevator ride down felt endless. The weight of the box in my arms. Nothing compared to the weight of what had just happened. I was unemployed. In a city where marketing jobs were competitive and rare, where my savings account had exactly $437, where I had no family to fall back on and no safety net beyond my own determination. I walked out of the building into a crisp October morning, the kind of day that should have felt full of possibility. Instead, it felt like the beginning of the end. I stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, watching people hurry past with their coffee cups and their purposeful strides, everyone going somewhere important while I had nowhere to go. My phone buzzed. A text from my landlord, Mr. Chen, reminding me that rent was due in 3 days. Perfect timing. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, but I was afraid that if I started laughing, I wouldn't be able to stop. I took the bus home, clutching my box of belongings like it contained something precious instead of just a few personal photos, a coffee mug, and a small succulent that had somehow survived 2 years under fluorescent lighting. The apartment felt different when I walked in, smaller and shabbier than it had that morning. The smell of curry from downstairs, which had always been mildly annoying, now seemed overwhelming. I set the box down on my kitchen counter and stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. 2 hours ago, I'd been a marketing coordinator with a steady paycheck and health insurance. Now I was unemployed, with less than $500 to my name and no immediate prospects. The logical part of my brain kicked in, the part that had gotten me through 4 years of college on scholarships and part-time jobs. I needed to update my resume, start networking, reach out to contacts in the industry. I needed to file for unemployment benefits, start looking for temporary work, maybe see if I could pick up freelance projects. I needed to call Mr. Chen and see if he'd accept a partial payment on rent. But first, I needed to sit down and let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. I sank onto my couch, a second-hand piece I'd bought from a Craigslist seller who'd claimed it was gently used, but had clearly been home to at least one cat with boundary issues. The tears came then, hot and sudden, and completely overwhelming. I cried for the job I'd lost, for the career path that had just been derailed, for the financial security that had never been secure at all. I cried for the presentation I'd been working on for months, the one that would now have someone else's name on it. I cried for the Morrison campaign that I'd helped develop from the ground up, the client relationships I'd built, the small victories that had made the long hours and modest paycheck feel worthwhile. Most of all, I cried for the future I'd been planning, the one that had seemed so attainable just hours before. I'd been saving for a better apartment, maybe one with a real kitchen and windows that actually opened. I'd been planning to take a vacation, something small but meaningful, maybe a long weekend in Seattle. I'd been thinking about grad school, about taking night classes to get my MBA. All of that felt impossible now. My phone rang, jarring me out of my spiral of self-pity. It was my best friend Sarah, calling from her office in Seattle where she worked as a software developer and made twice what I'd been making at Brennan Associates. "Hey, how's your Tuesday going?" she asked, her voice bright and cheerful. I almost lied. The impulse was so strong, so automatic. "Fine," I could have said. Just another day at the office. But something in me couldn't manage it, couldn't pretend that everything was normal when my entire world had just shifted. "I got fired," I said instead, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "What? Lori, what happened?" I told her everything. From Patricia's cryptic text, to the security escort, to the box of belongings now sitting on my kitchen counter. Sarah listened without interrupting, making the appropriate sympathetic noises at all the right moments. "I'm so sorry," she said when I finished. "This is completely insane. They can't just eliminate your position without warning." "Apparently they can. What are you going to do?" It was the question I'd been dreading, the one I didn't have a good answer for. "I don't know. Start looking for another job, I guess. File for unemployment. Try not to get evicted." "You could come stay with me for a while," Sarah offered. "I've got a spare room, and the tech scene here is booming. You could probably find something pretty quickly." The offer was tempting, more tempting than I wanted to admit. Sarah had a beautiful apartment in Capitol Hill, a job she loved, and the kind of financial stability that let her buy organic groceries without checking her bank balance first. But something in me resisted the idea of running away, of admitting defeat so completely. "I appreciate it," I said, "but I want to try to make it work here first. Portland's my home, you know." "Okay, but the offer stands. And Lori, you're going to be fine. You're smart and talented and hardworking. Some other company is going to be lucky to have you." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But sitting in my tiny apartment, surrounded by the detritus of my former life, it was hard to feel lucky about anything. After Sarah hung up, I spent the rest of the day in a strange limbo.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
I updated my resume, sent out a few applications to jobs I found online, and made a list of contacts I could reach out to. But mostly, I just sat there, staring at my laptop screen and trying to figure out how I'd gotten here. I'd done everything right, or at least everything I thought was right. I'd graduated summa cum laude from Portland State with a degree in marketing. I'd interned at 3 different companies during college, building a portfolio of work that I'd been proud of. I'd been a model employee at Brennan Associates, arriving early, staying late, volunteering for extra projects. And none of it had mattered. When push came to shove, when the company needed to cut costs, I'd been expendable. Just another line item in a budget, easily eliminated with a folder full of paperwork and a security escort. The phone rang again around 6. I assumed it was Sarah calling back with more job search advice, but the number on the screen was one I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. "Hello? Is this Lorraine Wood?" The voice was crisp, professional, with a slight accent I couldn't place. "Yes, this is she. My name is Victoria Sterling. I'm calling on behalf of a client who may have a position that would interest you." I sat up straighter, suddenly alert. "What kind of position?" "It's rather unique, which is why I'm calling you directly rather than going through traditional channels. My client is looking for someone with your particular background and skills for a private consulting role." Private consulting. It sounded mysterious, and probably too good to be true, but I was in no position to be picky. Can you tell me more about it? Not over the phone, I'm afraid, but if you're interested, I'd like to schedule a meeting for tomorrow morning. Are you available? I almost laughed. Was I available? I was unemployed. I was available for anything that might pay me enough to keep a roof over my head. Yes, I'm available. Excellent. 10 o'clock at the Heathman Hotel, in the lobby. I'll be carrying a red leather portfolio. She hung up before I could ask any more questions, leaving me staring at my phone in confusion. It was the kind of call that would have seemed ridiculous under normal circumstances, mysterious, vague, potentially dangerous. But these weren't normal circumstances. These were desperate circumstances. I spent the rest of the evening researching Victoria Sterling online, but I couldn't find anything concrete. There were a few mentions of a Sterling consulting group, but their website was minimal and told me nothing about what they actually did. It felt like the kind of company that existed in the shadows, dealing with clients who valued discretion above all else. I should have been more cautious. I should have asked more questions, demanded more information. But I was 26 years old, unemployed, and running out of options. When you're drowning, you don't question the rope that's thrown to you. I went to bed that night with my alarm set for 7, my best interview outfit laid out on the chair by my bed, and a strange mixture of hope and terror churning in my stomach. I had no idea what I was walking into, no idea what kind of job required this level of secrecy and intrigue. I had no idea that in less than 24 hours I would be standing in the marble hallway of a mansion in the West Hills, hesitating for exactly 17 seconds before knocking on a door that would change my life forever. I had no idea that Sebastian Ashford was already watching me. The Heathman Hotel was exactly the kind of place I'd only ever walked past, never through. Its lobby was all polished marble and crystal chandeliers, the kind of understated luxury that whispered money rather than shouting it. I arrived 15 minutes early, partly out of nervousness and partly because I'd taken the bus, and wasn't entirely sure how long the journey would take. I spotted Victoria Sterling immediately. She was impossible to miss, sitting in a leather armchair near the windows with a red portfolio balanced perfectly on her knees. She was probably in her early 40s, with platinum blonde hair pulled back in a chignon that looked like it had been crafted by a professional, and she wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than I'd made in a month at Brennan Associates. "Miss Wood," she said, rising to greet me before I'd even approached her chair. "Thank you for coming." Her handshake was firm, her smile polite but cool. Everything about Victoria Sterling suggested efficiency and discretion, from her perfectly manicured nails to the way she gestured for me to sit in the chair across from her without wasting time on small talk. "I imagine you have questions," she said, settling back into her seat and opening the red portfolio. "A few," I admitted. "Starting with what kind of consulting work requires this level of secrecy?" Victoria's smile widened slightly, as if she approved of my directness. "My client values his privacy above all else. He's had some unfortunate experiences with previous consultants who proved to be indiscreet." She handed me a document from her portfolio. "This is a non-disclosure agreement. Standard language, but quite comprehensive. You'll need to sign it before we can discuss the specifics of the position." I scanned the document quickly. It was indeed comprehensive, covering everything from social media posts to casual conversations with friends. The penalties for breach were severe enough to make my lawyer-trained mind wince, even though I'd never been to law school. "This seems extreme for a consulting position," I said. "My client's business interests are complex and often sensitive. He requires absolute discretion from anyone in his employ." Victoria's tone suggested that this was not negotiable. "If you're not comfortable with these terms, I understand completely. There are other candidates." The threat was subtle but clear. I was replaceable, and we both knew it. I thought about my dwindling bank account, about the rent that was due in 2 days, about the stack of job applications I had sent out with no responses. I signed the document. "Excellent," Victoria said, sliding the NDA back into her portfolio. "Now we can begin. My client is Sebastian Ashford, I assume you're familiar with the name? I wasn't, but I tried not to let it show. Could you refresh my memory? Mr. Ashford is the founder and CEO of Ashford Technologies. They specialize in cybersecurity and data protection for high-profile clients, politicians, celebrities, Fortune 500 companies. His systems protect some of the most sensitive information in the world. She pulled out a tablet and showed me a photo. Sebastian Ashford was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 30s, with dark hair and intense blue eyes. He was handsome in an austere way, like a marble statue that had been carved with mathematical precision rather than artistic passion. He's also somewhat reclusive, Victoria continued. He works primarily from his estate in the West Hills, and rarely makes public appearances. This is where you would come in. I'm not sure I understand. What exactly would I be consulting on? Victoria set the tablet aside and leaned forward slightly. Mr. Ashford requires someone to manage his public-facing communications, press releases, social media presence, client correspondence. Someone who can represent his interests while maintaining the level of privacy and discretion he requires. It sounded like a marketing job dressed up in mysterious language, but I wasn't about to complain. And this would be based at his estate? Yes, he has a fully equipped office space that you would use. The position would be live-in, at least initially, to ensure seamless integration with his existing operations. Live-in. The phrase caught my attention immediately. No rent, no utilities, no grocery bills. It would solve my immediate financial crisis and give me time to figure out my next move. What kind of compensation are we talking about? I asked. Victoria named a figure that made me blink. It was more than I'd been making at Brennan Associates, significantly more. Enough to not just survive, but to actually save money, to build the kind of financial cushion I'd never been able to afford. There are additional benefits, she continued. Full health coverage, meals included, use of the estate's amenities. Mr. Ashford believes in compensating his employees well in exchange for their complete dedication. Complete dedication. Another phrase that seemed loaded with meaning. How many other employees live on the estate? The household staff primarily. A chef, housekeeping, groundskeeping, security. You would be the only consultant in residence. I tried to imagine what it would be like, living in some wealthy recluse's mansion in the hills above Portland. It sounded like something out of a Gothic novel, mysterious and potentially dangerous. But it also sounded like a solution to every problem I was currently facing. When would this position start? I asked. Immediately, if you're interested. Mr. Ashford is quite eager to fill the role. Eager enough to make an offer to someone he'd never met, based on a recommendation from sources unknown. It should have raised more red flags than it did, but desperation has a way of quieting reasonable doubts. I'd like to meet him first, I said, before I make a decision. Victoria's expression flickered just for a moment, with something that might have been surprise. Of course. That can be arranged. This afternoon, if you're available. We spent another few minutes discussing logistics and expectations. Victoria gave me her business card and a folder containing more information about Ashford Technologies, including financial statements that proved the company was not only legitimate but extraordinarily successful. By the time I left the Heathman, I had an appointment to visit Sebastian Ashford's estate at 3 o'clock that afternoon. I spent the intervening hours researching everything I could find about both Sebastian Ashford and his company. The information was surprisingly sparse for someone who supposedly ran a major cybersecurity firm. There were a few professional photos, some business articles that mentioned Ashford Technologies in passing, but nothing personal. No social media presence, no interviews, no profiles in tech magazines. It was as if Sebastian Ashford existed only in the most official, sanitized contexts. Ashford Technologies was a different story. The company had an impressive client list and a reputation for absolute discretion. They'd handled cybersecurity for several high-profile political campaigns, protected client data during major corporate mergers, and consulted on government contracts that remained classified. It was the kind of company that operated in the shadows but commanded serious respect in its industry. At 2:30, I took a lift up into the West Hills. The driver, a chatty man named Carlos, kept up a steady stream of commentary about the houses we passed, each one larger and more impressive than the last. Old Portland money, he explained, pointing out mansions that had been in the same families for generations. Tech money, he said about the newer constructions, all glass and steel and dramatic angles. Sebastian Ashford's estate fell into the latter category. The house was stunning in a way that seemed almost aggressive. It was built into the hillside, all clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected the afternoon sun like mirrors. The architecture was modern, but not cold, incorporating natural materials like stone and wood that made it feel connected to the landscape around it. It was the kind of house that belonged in architectural magazines, the kind that made ordinary people feel small and insignificant by comparison. The gates opened automatically as our car approached, and Carlos whistled low under his breath. "I've driven up here plenty of times," he said, "but I've never seen this place open up for anyone. You must be somebody special." I didn't feel special. I felt nervous and underdressed, and completely out of my depth. But I thanked Carlos, tipped him more than I could afford, and walked up the curved stone pathway to the front door. The door opened before I could knock. A woman in her 50s, wearing a crisp white blouse and black pants, smiled warmly at me. "Miss Wood? I'm Helena, Mr. Ashford's assistant. He's waiting for you in his office." Helena led me through a series of hallways that showcased the house's impressive architecture. The interior was as stunning as the exterior, all open spaces and natural light. But it felt oddly empty. There were expensive furnishings and carefully curated art pieces, but no personal touches. No family photos, no books left casually on tables, no signs that anyone actually lived here. "Mr. Ashford works quite a bit," Helena said, as if she'd noticed my observations. "He's very focused on his business." We stopped outside a door made of dark wood, and Helena knocked softly before opening it. "Mr. Ashford? Miss Wood is here. Send her in." The voice was deep, carefully modulated, with an authority that seemed to fill the room before I even stepped inside. I took a breath and crossed the threshold into Sebastian Ashford's office. The room was large, but not ostentatious, with windows that offered a spectacular view of the city below. Sebastian Ashford sat behind a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of ebony, his attention focused on multiple computer monitors that displayed streams of data I couldn't begin to understand. He looked up as I entered, and I felt the full force of those intense blue eyes that had been striking even in the photograph. "Miss Wood," he said, rising from his chair. "Thank you for coming." He was taller than I'd expected, probably 6'2" or 6'3", with the kind of presence that seemed to alter the energy of the room. He was handsome, certainly, but there was something almost intimidating about the precision of his features, the way he seemed to take in everything about me in a single glance. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. I sat, acutely aware of his scrutiny. Sebastian Ashford studied me the way I imagined he studied data streams, looking for patterns and anomalies, searching for information that others might miss. "Victoria tells me you're interested in the position," he said. "I'm interested in learning more about it," I replied carefully. A slight smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Cautious. I appreciate that. In my line of work, caution is often the difference between success and catastrophe." He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "What do you know about cybersecurity, Miss Wood?" "Honestly? Not much beyond the basics. I know it's important, and I know that data breaches can be devastating for companies. But I'm not a technical person." "Good. Technical people often overcomplicate things. What I need is someone who can translate complex concepts into language that normal people can understand. Someone who can manage communications without getting lost in the technical details." He turned one of his monitors toward me, showing what appeared to be a social media dashboard. "This is my company's current online presence. As you can see, it's minimal." That was an understatement. The Ashford Technologies social media accounts were essentially corporate brochures, all dry press releases and industry announcements. There was no personality, no engagement, no sense that actual human beings worked there. My clients prefer discretion, Sebastian continued, but potential clients need to know we exist. It's a delicate balance, and one that requires a particular kind of expertise. What kind of expertise? The ability to say everything and nothing at the same time. To project competence without revealing capabilities. To build trust without offering transparency. He paused, those blue eyes fixed on mine. It's not a skill set that everyone possesses. I thought about my work at Brennan Associates, the campaigns I developed that had successfully promoted clients while carefully managing their public image. It wasn't exactly the same thing, but the principles were similar. I think I understand, I said. Do you? Sebastian leaned forward slightly. Tell me about the most challenging communication project you've ever managed. I thought for a moment, then told him about a client at Brennan Associates who'd been involved in a minor scandal. Nothing criminal, just a social media mishap that had blown up in the local press. I'd been tasked with managing the response, crafting statements that acknowledged the mistake without admitting fault, expressing regret without accepting liability. Sebastian listened without interrupting, his expression giving nothing away. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Interesting approach, he said finally. You focused on controlling the narrative rather than defending the behavior. The behavior was indefensible, I said, but the person wasn't. There's a difference. Something shifted in Sebastian's expression, so subtle that I might have imagined it. There is indeed. He stood up, moving to the window that overlooked the city. The position would require you to live here, at least initially. You'd have your own suite, complete privacy, but you'd be on call whenever needed. Are you comfortable with that arrangement? On call whenever needed. Another phrase that seemed loaded with implications I didn't fully understand. What does whenever needed typically look like? I work unusual hours, Sebastian said without turning around. I have clients in different time zones, projects that don't follow normal business schedules. Sometimes crisis management requires immediate attention, regardless of the time of day. It sounded demanding, potentially overwhelming, but it also sounded like job security, like the kind of position that would value my skills and compensate me accordingly. I can be flexible, I said. Sebastian turned back to face me, and for a moment I felt like he was seeing something in me that I didn't even know was there. Victoria mentioned that you recently left your previous position. May I ask why? I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Budget cuts. My position was eliminated. After 2 years of employment and excellent performance reviews? The fact that he knew those details should have surprised me, but somehow it didn't. Sebastian Ashford was clearly the type of man who researched everything and everyone before making decisions. Yes, I said simply. Their loss, he said, and something in his tone suggested he meant it. When could you start? The question caught me off guard. You're offering me the position? I'm offering you the opportunity to excel at it. Whether you succeed or fail will depend entirely on your performance. It wasn't exactly a ringing endorsement, but it was a job. A well-paying job with benefits and housing included, working for a successful company in an industry that was clearly thriving. It was also mysterious and potentially complicated, working for a man who seemed to know more about me than I knew about him. I thought about my empty apartment, about the rent I couldn't pay, about the stack of unanswered job applications on my laptop. I thought about the alternative, which was unemployment and the slow slide toward financial ruin. I could start Monday, I said. Sebastian nodded, as if my acceptance had been a foregone conclusion. Helena will show you to your suite so you can see the accommodations. If everything meets with your approval, we can finalize the paperwork. He returned to his desk, his attention already shifting back to the monitors. I had the distinct impression that I'd been dismissed, that my interview was over whether I realized it or not. Helena appeared in the doorway as if she'd been waiting for a signal I hadn't seen. Miss Wood, shall we take a look at your rooms? I followed her out of Sebastian's office. my mind racing with questions I hadn't thought to ask. What exactly would my day-to-day responsibilities be? Who else would I be working with? What had happened to the previous person in this position? Helena led me up a curved staircase to the second floor, down another hallway lined with windows that offered glimpses of the grounds outside. The estate was even larger than I'd realized, with gardens and pathways that disappeared into the trees beyond. "Here we are," Helena said, opening a door near the end of the hallway. The suite was bigger than my entire apartment. There was a sitting area with a couch and armchairs arranged around a fireplace, a bedroom with a king-sized bed and windows that looked out over the city, and a bathroom that belonged in a luxury hotel. Everything was decorated in neutral tones, elegant but impersonal, like a very expensive rental property. "The office space is just down the hall," Helena said, showing me a room equipped with the latest technology, multiple monitors, and ergonomic furniture that probably cost more than my car. Mr. Ashford had it specially designed for the position. "It's beautiful," I said, because it was true. It was also intimidating and surreal, and completely unlike anything I'd ever experienced. "Mr. Ashford believes in providing the best possible working conditions," Helena said. "He finds that people perform better when they're comfortable and have everything they need." I wondered what people she was referring to. How many consultants had lived in this suite? How many had worked in that office down the hall? And why had they all apparently left? What happened to the person who had this position before me? I asked. Helena's expression flickered, just for a moment. "There have been several consultants over the years. Mr. Ashford has very high standards." It wasn't really an answer, but it was clearly all I was going to get. Helena showed me the rest of the suite, explained how the security system worked, and gave me a brief tour of the common areas I'd have access to. The kitchen was a chef's dream, staffed by professionals who prepared meals for the household. The library was extensive and beautiful, with floor-to-ceiling shelves and comfortable reading areas. There was a gym, a pool, even a small movie theater. It was like being offered a life upgrade that I couldn't afford to refuse. By the time Helena walked me back to the front door, I'd made my decision. The salary alone would solve my immediate problems, and the experience would be invaluable, regardless of how long the position lasted. If Sebastian Ashford had high standards that meant previous consultants had failed to meet them, well, I'd just have to be better than they were. "I'll take it," I told Helena as we reached the front entrance. She smiled, the first genuinely warm expression I'd seen since arriving at the estate. "Wonderful. I'll prepare the contracts for you to review. Can you be ready to move in by Sunday?" Sunday was 3 days away. It would give me time to pack my belongings, arrange for storage of the few pieces of furniture I owned, and close out my lease with Mr. Chen. It would also give me time to second-guess my decision, to wonder what I was getting myself into. "Sunday works," I said. Helena handed me another business card, this one with her contact information. "Call me if you have any questions. Otherwise, I'll see you Sunday morning at 10. I took the lift back down the hill toward the city, watching the estate disappear behind the trees as we descended. The driver this time was a young woman who chatted about the weather and traffic. Normal conversation that felt strange after the intensity of my interview with Sebastian Ashford. By the time I reached my apartment, the sun was setting over Portland, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me how beautiful the city could be. I climbed the stairs to my studio, breathing in the familiar smell of curry and cleaning products, and tried to process what had just happened. I'd taken a job working for a man I didn't really know, living in a house that felt more like a fortress than a home, managing communications for a company that operated in the shadows of the tech industry. It was either the best decision I'd ever made or the beginning of a very complicated situation. I spent the evening packing, sorting through my belongings and deciding what was worth keeping and what could be donated or discarded. It was amazing how little I actually owned that mattered, how easily my entire life could fit into a few suitcases and boxes. As I folded clothes and wrapped dishes in newspaper, I found myself thinking about Sebastian Ashford's intense blue eyes, the way he'd studied me like I was a puzzle he was trying to solve. There had been something almost predatory about his attention, but also something that felt like recognition, as if he'd seen something in me that I didn't know was there. I'd told myself that this was just a job, a temporary solution to my financial problems. But as I taped up the last box and looked around my empty apartment, I had the distinct feeling that I was crossing a threshold from which there might not be any return. Sunday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical October weather in Portland. I stood outside the estate gates at exactly 10 o'clock, my belongings loaded into a hired van, watching as the massive iron barriers swung open to admit me. Helena met me at the front door with her usual efficiency, directing the movers and making sure my belongings were delivered to the correct rooms. "Mr. Ashford is in meetings this morning," she explained as we watched my life being carried into the house. "But he'll want to see you this afternoon to go over your initial projects. The phrase reminded me that this was real, that I was actually going to be working here, living here, becoming part of whatever Sebastian Ashford had built in his fortress on the hill. As the movers finished unloading and departed, I found myself standing in the foyer of the most beautiful house I'd ever seen, surrounded by luxury I'd never experienced, about to begin a job that still felt mysterious and undefined. Helena showed me to my office, explained the computer systems and security protocols, and left me with a stack of files to review. I spent the morning reading about Ashford Technology's current clients and projects, trying to understand the scope of the work I'd be managing. It was complex and fascinating, involving everything from protecting election systems to securing communications for multinational corporations. The technical details were beyond me, but the communication challenges were exactly the kind of problems I enjoyed solving. Around noon, Helena brought me lunch and mentioned that Mr. Ashford would see me in his office at 2 o'clock. I used the time to familiarize myself with the social media accounts I'd be managing, the press releases that needed to be written, and the client communications that required attention. At 2 o'clock sharp, I knocked on Sebastian's office door. "Come in." He was standing by the windows again, but this time he turned to face me immediately. "How are you settling in?" "Very well, thank you. The accommodations are incredible." "Good. I want you to be comfortable here." He moved to his desk and gestured for me to sit in the same chair I'd occupied during my interview. "I have several projects that need immediate attention." For the next hour, Sebastian outlined my responsibilities in detail. I would be managing all external communications for Ashford Technologies, from social media to press releases to client correspondence. I would be crafting responses to media inquiries, developing content strategies, and serving as the primary point of contact for anyone seeking information about the company. It was exactly the kind of work I'd hoped to be doing at Brennan Associates, the kind of strategic communications role that could launch a serious career. The fact that I'd be doing it for a cybersecurity firm only made it more intriguing. "Questions?" Sebastian asked when he'd finished his overview. "Just one. Why me?" "I mean, my background is solid, but you could probably afford much more experienced consultants. People with specialized knowledge of the tech industry." Sebastian was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming softly against his desk. "Experience can be valuable," he said finally, "but it can also be limiting. People with extensive backgrounds often come with preconceived notions about how things should be done. You don't have those limitations." It was a diplomatic answer, but I sensed there was more to it. Sebastian Ashford didn't seem like the type of man who made important decisions based on potential alone. There was something specific he wanted from me, some particular quality he thought I possessed. "I won't let you down," I said. "I'm counting on that." As I left his office and returned to my own workspace, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just committed to something much more significant than a consulting job. Sebastian Ashford was clearly a man who operated on multiple levels, who saw angles and opportunities that others missed. Working for him would be a challenge, but it might also be the chance I'd been waiting for without even realizing it. I spent the rest of the afternoon diving into my new responsibilities, drafting social media content, and reviewing press materials. The work was engaging and complex, requiring exactly the kind of strategic thinking I'd always enjoyed. For the first time since leaving Brennan Associates, I felt like I was using my skills in a meaningful way. As evening approached, Helena stopped by my office to let me know that dinner would be served in the small dining room at 7, and that Mr. Ashford would be joining me. It would be my first meal as a resident of the estate, my first real social interaction with my new employer. I returned to my suite to change into something more appropriate for dinner, settling on a simple black dress that struck the right balance between professional and elegant. As I applied lipstick in the bathroom mirror, I caught my own eyes and wondered what Sebastian Ashford saw when he looked at me. Whatever it was, it had been enough to convince him to offer me this opportunity. I was about to find out if it would be enough to help me succeed in it. Dinner was served in what Helena called the small dining room, though it was larger than most people's living rooms. The table was set for 2, with china that looked like it belonged in a museum and crystal glasses that caught the light from a chandelier overhead. Sebastian was already seated when I arrived, dressed in a dark sweater that made his blue eyes even more striking. "I hope you don't mind eating late," he said as I took the seat across from him. "I tend to lose track of time when I'm working." The meal was prepared by Marcus, the estate's chef, who had apparently trained at some famous culinary school in France. Each course was a work of art, beautifully plated and perfectly seasoned. But I found it difficult to focus on the food when Sebastian's attention seemed so entirely focused on me. "Tell me about your family," he said as we started the appetizer course. It was such a normal question, the kind of thing people asked when they were getting to know each other. But something about the way Sebastian asked it made me feel like he was conducting research rather than making conversation. "There's not much to tell," I said carefully. "My parents died in a car accident when I was 16. I was raised by my grandmother after that. That must have been difficult." It was, but my grandmother was wonderful. She made sure I finished high school, helped me apply for college scholarships. She died my junior year. Sebastian nodded thoughtfully. "So you've been on your own for quite some time." "I suppose I have. That kind of independence can be valuable," he said. "People who've had to rely on themselves tend to be more resourceful, more adaptable." Again, I had the feeling that he was categorizing me somehow, filing away information for some purpose I didn't understand. But his tone was warm, almost sympathetic, and I found myself relaxing despite my reservations. "What about you?" I asked. "Do you have family in Portland?" Something flickered across Sebastian's expression so quickly that I might have imagined it. "My parents live in Europe now. We're not particularly close." He changed the subject then, asking about my college experience, my career goals, my thoughts on the tech industry. The conversation flowed more easily than I'd expected, and I found myself genuinely enjoying his company. Sebastian was intelligent and well-read, with insights about everything from politics to literature that kept me engaged throughout the meal. It wasn't until we were finishing dessert that he said something that made me pause. "I've been watching your work today," he said casually, as if he were commenting on the weather. "The social media content you drafted was excellent." Exactly the tone I was hoping for. Watching my work. The phrase stuck with me as Helena appeared to clear the dishes. How had Sebastian been watching my work? Had he been reviewing my computer activity remotely? Did he have cameras in the office I was using? "I'm glad it met your expectations," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "More than met them. You have an intuitive understanding of what this company needs, how to present our capabilities, without revealing too much. It's a rare skill." After dinner, Sebastian excused himself to return to his office, mentioning something about a client in Tokyo who needed urgent consultation. I returned to my suite, but found myself too restless to settle down for the evening. Instead, I decided to explore the estate a bit more, to familiarize myself with my new surroundings. The house was even more impressive at night, with subtle lighting that highlighted the architectural details and made the artwork on the walls seem to glow. I wandered through the main level, admiring the way the spaces flowed together, the careful balance of luxury and comfort that made the house feel lived in despite its size. I was standing in the library, running my fingers along the spines of first edition novels, when I heard voices coming from somewhere nearby. One was Sebastian's distinctive baritone, but I couldn't identify the other speaker. They were talking quietly, but something about their tone suggested urgency, even conflict. I moved closer to the sound, following it to a set of double doors that were slightly ajar. Through the gap, I could see Sebastian pacing in what appeared to be another office, his phone pressed to his ear. "That's not acceptable," he was saying. "We had an agreement." The other voice was coming through the speakerphone, distorted, but clearly agitated. "The situation has changed. There are new variables that weren't part of the original calculation." "What kind of variables?" "The Portland project is attracting more attention than we anticipated. Questions are being asked that we'd prefer not to answer." I pressed closer to the doors, straining to hear more clearly. "Portland project. What did that mean? And why did it sound like Sebastian was involved in something that was causing problems?" "How much attention?" Sebastian asked. "Enough that we need to consider alternative strategies. The current approach may be too visible." "I disagree. Visibility can be managed if you know what you're doing." "This isn't about management, Sebastian. This is about exposure. If the wrong people start connecting the right dots, it could compromise everything we've built." There was a long pause, and I could see Sebastian running his hand through his hair, a gesture that suggested frustration or stress. "What are you proposing?" he asked finally. "Suspension of operations until the heat dies down. Maybe 6 months, maybe longer." "Absolutely not. Too much has been invested to walk away now." "Then we need insurance, something that ensures discretion even if the situation becomes more complicated." "What kind of insurance?" Another pause, this one even longer. When the voice on the speakerphone spoke again, it was so quiet that I had to strain to hear it. "The kind that involves people who have too much to lose to talk." I felt a chill run down my spine. The conversation had taken a turn that felt distinctly threatening, though I wasn't sure exactly what was being threatened, or by whom. I took a step back from the doors, suddenly aware that I was eavesdropping on something I definitely wasn't supposed to hear. That's when the floorboard creaked. The sound was small, probably inaudible to anyone who wasn't listening for it. But in the silence that followed, it might as well have been a gunshot. The conversation in the office stopped abruptly. "I'll call you back," Sebastian said curtly. I heard footsteps approaching the doors and realized I had about 3 seconds to decide whether to flee or try to explain my presence. I chose a middle path, grabbing a book from the nearest shelf and pretending to be absorbed in reading as I walked away from the office. The doors opened just as I was settling into one of the leather chairs near the fireplace. Sebastian appeared in the doorway, his eyes scanning the library until they found me. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "Too much excitement, I think," I said, holding up the book I'd grabbed. "I thought some reading might help." Sebastian's gaze moved to the book in my hands, and I saw his eyebrow raise slightly. I looked down and realized I'd accidentally chosen a volume of Shakespearean sonnets. Not exactly light bedtime reading. "Ambitious choice," he said with what might have been amusement. "I've always found poetry soothing," I lied smoothly. Sebastian studied me for a moment longer, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that he was calculating something, weighing possibilities and probabilities in that sharp mind of his. "Well, don't stay up too late," he said finally. "Tomorrow will be a busy day." He disappeared back into his office, closing the doors firmly behind him. I sat there for another few minutes, staring at the sonnets without seeing them, trying to process what I'd overheard. Portland project. Alternative strategies. Insurance involving people who had too much to lose to talk. Whatever Sebastian Ashford was involved in, it was more complex and potentially more dangerous than a simple cybersecurity business. And I was now living in his house, working for his company, potentially becoming one of those people who had too much to lose to talk. I returned to my suite that night with my mind racing, but I forced myself to follow my normal bedtime routine. I took a shower, brushed my teeth, and climbed into the most comfortable bed I'd ever slept in. But sleep was elusive, and I found myself staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house settling around me. Sometime after midnight, I heard a car pull up outside. I went to the window and saw a black sedan parked in the circular driveway, its engine running. A man in a dark suit got out and walked to the front door, which opened before he could knock. Helena appeared, exchanged a few words with the visitor, and then led him inside. I watched from my window as lights came on in various parts of the house, including Sebastian's office. The meeting, whatever it was about, lasted almost 2 hours. When the visitor finally left, I noticed that he was carrying a briefcase that he hadn't had when he arrived. The next morning, I arrived at my office to find a stack of new projects waiting for me. Press releases to draft, client communications to review, and a social media strategy to develop for a product launch that was apparently happening within the next 2 weeks. It was exactly the kind of work I'd been hired to do, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was also a test of some kind. Sebastian stopped by my office around 10 o'clock, ostensibly to check on my progress, but really, I suspected, to gauge my mood after the previous evening. "How are you settling in?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe in a way that seemed casual but somehow still commanding. "Very well. The work is challenging but manageable." "Good. I have a client meeting this afternoon that I'd like you to sit in on. Observer only, but it will give you a better sense of how we operate." The client meeting took place in Sebastian's office at 3 o'clock. The client was a woman named Jennifer Walsh, who apparently ran communications for a major pharmaceutical company. She was probably in her 50s, with steel gray hair, and the kind of authoritative presence that suggested she was used to being the smartest person in the room. "We have a situation," she said without preamble once the introductions had been made. "Someone is trying to access our research databases. Our internal security caught the attempts, but we're concerned about what else might be compromised." Sebastian listened without interrupting as Jennifer described the cyber attack in detail. It was sophisticated, she explained, targeted specifically at their most sensitive research projects. The kind of attack that suggested inside knowledge of their systems and procedures. "What kind of research?" Sebastian asked. Jennifer hesitated. "Neurological applications. Treatments for PTSD, depression, anxiety disorders. Some of it is still experimental, but the potential applications are significant." Significant enough that someone would go to considerable effort to steal it? Significant enough that certain parties would be very interested in controlling it. The conversation continued for another hour, with Sebastian asking detailed questions about the company's security protocols, the timing of the attacks, and the potential motivations of whoever was behind them. I took notes throughout the meeting, trying to understand not just what was being discussed, but why Sebastian had wanted me to observe it. After Jennifer left, Sebastian turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "What did you think?" he asked. "About the meeting? It sounds like a serious situation." "It is, but I'm more interested in your impression of the client. What did you notice about her?" I thought for a moment. "She was nervous. Not about the security breach itself, but about something else. Something she wasn't telling you." Sebastian nodded approvingly. "Very good. What else?" "She mentioned certain parties being interested in controlling the research. That's not how someone talks about random hackers or corporate competitors. It sounds more like she knows specifically who's behind the attacks." Excellent observation. In this business, what clients don't tell you is often more important than what they do tell you. Sebastian moved to his desk and pulled out a file. "I want you to draft a communications strategy for this situation. How do we help Jennifer's company manage the public narrative if this breach becomes public knowledge?" It was exactly the kind of challenge I'd been hoping for, the chance to apply my skills to a real crisis situation. But as I returned to my office to begin working on the strategy, I couldn't stop thinking about the tension I'd sensed in that meeting, the feeling that there were layers of complexity I wasn't seeing. Over the next several days, I threw myself into the work with an intensity that surprised me. The projects Sebastian gave me were more interesting and challenging than anything I'd worked on at Brennan Associates, requiring a level of strategic thinking that kept me engaged for hours at a time. I found myself staying late in the office, refining press releases and social media content, developing communication strategies that balance transparency with discretion. Sebastian seemed pleased with my progress. He stopped by my office regularly, offering feedback and suggestions, sometimes staying to discuss broader questions about the industry or the company's goals. These conversations were always professional, but I began to sense a growing comfort between us, a mutual respect that made our working relationship increasingly smooth. It was during one of these conversations, about a week into my tenure at the estate, that Sebastian made a comment that caught my attention. "You have excellent instincts," he said, reviewing a press release I'd drafted about a new government contract. Better than I expected, actually. Better than you expected? Sebastian paused, as if he'd said more than he intended. I mean better than most consultants with your level of experience. You seem to understand intuitively what information to emphasize and what to downplay. I've always been good at reading situations, I guess. It's more than that. You understand discretion not just as a professional requirement, but as a survival skill. The phrase stuck with me. Discretion as a survival skill. It was an odd way to describe what was essentially marketing work, unless the work itself was more complicated than it appeared. That evening, I decided to explore more of the estate grounds. Helena had mentioned walking trails that wound through the forested property, and I thought some fresh air might help clear my head. The sun was setting as I left the house, casting long shadows across the manicured gardens that surrounded the main building. The trail was well maintained, but not heavily used, winding through stands of Douglas fir and cedar that blocked most of the city lights below. It was peaceful in a way that I hadn't experienced since moving to Portland. The kind of quiet that made me realize how much urban noise I'd been unconsciously filtering out. I'd been walking for about 20 minutes when I noticed the lights. They were off to my left, through the trees, too bright and too focused to be coming from another house. I left the trail and pushed through the underbrush, following the glow until I reached a clearing that contained what appeared to be a separate building, smaller than the main house but still substantial. The building was all glass and steel, modern and utilitarian in a way that contrasted sharply with the estate's main architecture. Through the windows, I could see banks of computer equipment, servers and monitors that cast an eerie blue glow throughout the interior. It looked less like an office, and more like a command center, the kind of facility that belonged in a science fiction movie. As I watched, a figure moved past one of the windows. Sebastian, I realized, though he looked different somehow in this environment. More focused, more intense, like he was in his natural habitat. He was talking to someone I couldn't see, gesturing toward one of the monitor arrays. I was about to turn back toward the main house when I heard voices approaching from the direction of the trail. Instinctively, I crouched behind a large fir tree, not wanting to be caught spying on whatever was happening in the glass building. Two men emerged from the trees, both wearing dark clothing and moving with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested they belonged here. One was carrying what appeared to be a laptop bag, the other had a manila envelope tucked under his arm. "He's expecting us," one of them said as they approached the building's entrance. "Good. This situation needs to be resolved quickly." They disappeared inside, and I saw the lights in several additional rooms come on. Whatever was happening in that building, it involved more people than I'd initially realized. I made my way back to the trail as quietly as possible, my mind racing with questions. What kind of cybersecurity work required a separate facility in the middle of the woods? Why had Sebastian never mentioned this building during his tour of the estate? And what kind of situation needed to be resolved so urgently that people were meeting about it after dark? When I returned to the main house, Helena was waiting in the foyer with a concerned expression. "Miss Wood, I was just coming to look for you. Mr. Ashford wanted to make sure you were all right." "I'm fine, just went for a walk on the trails." "Of course, he mentioned that you might enjoy the property." "Did you see anything interesting?" The question seemed casual, but something in Helena's tone suggested it wasn't. She was fishing for information, trying to determine what I might have discovered during my walk. "Beautiful trees," I said neutrally. "Very peaceful." Helena smiled, but I noticed that the expression didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yes, Mr. Ashford values his privacy. The estate provides an excellent retreat from the pressures of business." I excused myself and returned to my suite, but I found it even harder to concentrate than usual. The conversation I'd overheard my first night, the mysterious building in the woods, the late-night meetings and carefully worded questions, all pointed to something much more complex than a simple cybersecurity consultancy. I was beginning to suspect that Sebastian Ashford's business involved activities that required more than just discretion. They required secrecy, and possibly the kind of insurance that involved people who had too much to lose to talk. The question was whether I was becoming one of those people, and if so, what exactly I stood to lose. The answer came the next morning, in the form of a knock on my office door that I somehow knew would change everything. "Come in," I called, expecting to see Helena or one of the other staff members. Instead, Sebastian entered, but he wasn't alone. Behind him was a man I'd never seen before, tall and lean, with the kind of forgettable features that suggested he'd cultivated anonymity as a professional skill. He was carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the sort of expensive suit that managed to look both formal and threatening. "Lorraine," Sebastian said, "I'd like you to meet David Chen. He's a colleague of mine." David Chen stepped forward and extended his hand, but his grip was uncomfortably firm and his eyes never left my face, as if he were memorizing every detail of my appearance. "Ms. Wood," he said, "I've heard a great deal about your work here. Very impressive." "Thank you," I replied, though something about his tone suggested that his assessment hadn't been entirely positive. Sebastian closed the door behind them and gestured for everyone to sit. "David and I need to discuss a sensitive matter with you," he said. "Something that affects not just your work here, but your future in general." I felt my stomach tighten. "What kind of matter?" David Chen opened his portfolio and withdrew a tablet, which he placed on my desk facing me. The screen showed what appeared to be a financial document, though the numbers and accounts were unfamiliar. "This is your employment file," David said, "including background checks, financial history, and various other assessments we've conducted since you arrived." I stared at the screen, trying to process what I was seeing. "You've been investigating me?" "We investigate everyone," Sebastian said matter-of-factly. "It's standard procedure for anyone with access to sensitive information. But what I saw here goes beyond standard background checks. This is detailed financial analysis going back years, employment records from jobs I'd forgotten about, even academic transcripts from college." David swiped to another screen, this one showing what appeared to be a timeline of my recent activities. My job search after leaving Brennan Associates, my meeting with Victoria Sterling, even my arrival at the estate. "We've been watching you for longer than you realize," David said. "Long before Sebastian offered you this position." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Watching me? Why?" Sebastian leaned forward in his chair, his expression serious but not unkind. "Because you were perfect for what we needed. Intelligent, skilled, and most importantly, vulnerable enough to be grateful for the opportunity." Vulnerable? Unemployed. In financial distress. No family support system. Someone who would be unlikely to ask too many questions about the nature of the work. I felt anger rising in my chest, hot and indignant. So this was all a setup? The job, the salary, everything? "Not a setup," Sebastian said carefully. "An opportunity. For both of us." David swiped to another screen, and I saw my own face staring back at me from what appeared to be surveillance footage. I was standing outside Brennan Associates on the day I was fired, looking lost and devastated. "We've been monitoring situations like yours," David explained. "People with the right skills who find themselves in difficult circumstances. People who might be open to opportunities that others would reject." "What kind of opportunities?" Sebastian and David exchanged a glance, and I realized that we'd reached the moment of truth, the point where they would either fully trust me or eliminate me as a risk. "The kind that require absolute loyalty," Sebastian said finally, "and absolute silence." The silence in my office stretched until it became almost unbearable. Sebastian and David Chen sat across from me, waiting for my response to revelations that had turned my entire understanding of the situation upside down. I stared at the surveillance footage on the tablet screen, watching my own unknowing face as I stood outside Brennan and Associates that terrible morning, and felt something cold settle in my chest. "Absolute loyalty and absolute silence," I repeated slowly. "And if I refuse?" David's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture that made me acutely aware of how isolated I was in this room, in this house, in this life I'd stumbled into without understanding its true nature. "That would be unfortunate," he said quietly, "for everyone involved." Sebastian held up a hand, a gesture that somehow commanded immediate attention. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Lorraine deserves to understand what she's being asked to commit to before she makes any decisions." He stood up and moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the city below. What do you know about corporate espionage, Lorraine? The basics, I suppose. Companies stealing trade secrets from competitors, that sort of thing. That's the elementary version. The reality is much more complex, and much more lucrative. Sebastian turned back to face me, his blue eyes intense but not threatening. Ashford Technologies doesn't just protect data. We acquire it. The words hung in the air like a confession. I felt my world shift again, pieces of the puzzle I'd been unconsciously assembling suddenly clicking into place. The secretive clients, the mysterious meetings, the facility hidden in the woods. You're corporate spies, I said. We prefer the term information consultants, David replied with what might have been amusement. But essentially, yes. We gather intelligence for clients who need to know what their competitors, their partners, or their enemies are planning. Sebastian returned to his chair, his movements deliberate and controlled. The cybersecurity business is legitimate and profitable, but it's also the perfect cover for more specialized services. When you're already inside a company's digital infrastructure, it's remarkably easy to explore areas beyond your official mandate. I thought about Jennifer Walsh and her pharmaceutical company, the nervousness I'd sensed during her meeting with Sebastian. Your clients know what you really do? Some do. Others hire us for security consulting and remain blissfully unaware that we're simultaneously gathering intelligence for their competitors. Sebastian's tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather rather than corporate crimes. It's a delicate balance, but an extremely profitable one. David leaned forward, his hands folded on my desk. The work you've been doing, the communication strategies and press releases, they're not just about managing Ashford Technologies' public image. They're about creating plausible cover stories for our operations. My mind raced back through the projects I'd worked on over the past week. The press releases about government contracts, the social media content about cybersecurity innovations, the client communications about data protection services, all of it designed to create the appearance of a legitimate business, while hiding something much more complex underneath. The Portland project you mentioned, I said, looking at Sebastian. What is that? Sebastian and David exchanged another glance, and I could see them making real-time calculations about how much to reveal, how deeply to involve me in their world. A long-term intelligence gathering operation targeting several major corporations based in the Pacific Northwest, Sebastian said finally. Tech companies primarily, but also some aerospace and biotechnology firms. We've been building access to their systems for the better part of 2 years. And the new variables that were mentioned in your phone conversation? Sebastian's eyebrow raised slightly, confirming that he'd known I was listening that night. Federal investigators have started asking questions about some unusual network activity. Nothing that leads directly to us, but enough to make certain clients nervous. David opened his portfolio again and withdrew a different tablet. This is why we needed someone like you. Someone who could help us manage the narrative if our cover stories come under scrutiny. The screen showed a complex organizational chart, with Ashford Technologies at the center and dozens of lines connecting it to other companies, government agencies, and what appeared to be foreign corporations. It looked like a spiderweb of relationships and information flows, all controlled from Sebastian's estate in the West Hills. We're not common criminals, Sebastian said, perhaps sensing my growing unease. Our clients include government agencies, Fortune 500 companies, even foreign intelligence services. What we do operates in a gray area of the law, but it serves important purposes. What kind of purposes? Preventing industrial espionage by conducting it ourselves. Protecting national security by monitoring potential threats. Helping legitimate businesses make informed decisions about partnerships and acquisitions. Sebastian's voice took on an almost evangelical quality. Information is the most valuable commodity in the modern world, Lorraine. We simply ensure that it flows to the people who can use it most effectively. I stared at the organizational chart, trying to process the scope of what they were describing. And my role in all this? Continue doing exactly what you've been doing, David said. manage our public communications, craft our cover stories, help us maintain the appearance of a legitimate cybersecurity firm. The only difference is that now you understand the full context of your work. And in exchange? Sebastian smiled, the first genuine warmth I'd seen from him since the conversation began. The salary and benefits we discussed remain the same, but there are additional compensations available for those who prove themselves valuable to our operations. David swiped to another screen, showing financial projections that made my eyes widen. The numbers were staggering, more money than I'd ever imagined earning in a lifetime of traditional marketing work. These are performance bonuses, Sebastian explained, based on the success of operations that your communications work helps facilitate. Help us maintain our cover, and you'll be rewarded accordingly. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into an abyss that might contain either treasure or destruction. Everything logical and ethical in my nature told me to walk away, to refuse their offer and hope they'd let me leave quietly. But another part of me, the part that had been struggling to pay rent and student loans for years, was calculating what those bonuses could mean for my future. What happens if I say no? I asked. David's expression became very serious. That would create complications for everyone. You've seen sensitive information, learned about operations that could be compromised if disclosed. We'd need assurances that you understood the importance of discretion. What kind of assurances? Sebastian intervened before David could answer. The kind that protects everyone involved. You'd sign additional confidentiality agreements, accept certain restrictions on your future employment, and agree to periodic check-ins to ensure your continued discretion. It sounded reasonable on the surface, but I could hear the underlying threat. They would be watching me for the rest of my life, ready to intervene if I ever posed a risk to their operations. The freedom I'd thought I was gaining by taking this job was actually a more sophisticated form of captivity. And if I say yes, then you become a full partner in one of the most successful intelligence operations in the private sector, Sebastian said. You'll have access to resources and opportunities that most people can only dream of. You'll be part of something important, something that shapes the flow of information and power in the modern world. David closed the tablet and returned it to his portfolio. We need an answer, Ms. Wood, today. I looked back and forth between them. These two men who had orchestrated my recruitment so carefully, who had been watching me and manipulating my circumstances from the beginning. I thought about my empty apartment, my failed job search, the devastating meeting with Patricia Brennan that had started this entire chain of events. This was all planned, I said. My firing, the job offer, everything. Sebastian nodded slowly. Not planned, exactly. But we were monitoring several situations, waiting for the right opportunity to present itself. When you lost your position at Brennan Associates, you became an ideal candidate for recruitment. You had me fired? We had nothing to do with your termination, David said. That was simply an unfortunate business decision by your former employer. But we were aware of the financial pressures facing their company, and we maintained contacts who could inform us when staff reductions were being considered. The scope of their planning was breathtaking. They had been watching not just me but the entire industry, looking for opportunities to recruit people with the skills they needed and the vulnerabilities that would make them cooperative. How many others are there? I asked. How many people like me? You're not the first consultant we've recruited under similar circumstances, Sebastian admitted. But you're by far the most promising. Your instincts, your ability to understand complex situations and craft appropriate responses, those are rare qualities. I thought about the previous consultants Helena had mentioned, the ones who hadn't worked out for unstated reasons. Had they refused the offer I was being given? Had they been unable to handle the moral complexity of the work? Or had they simply proven inadequate to Sebastian's exacting standards? What happened to the others? They found positions elsewhere, David said smoothly. With our assistance and strong references, of course. We believe in taking care of people who work with us, regardless of how long that relationship lasts. But something in his tone suggested that the assistance provided to departing consultants came with strings attached, ongoing obligations that ensured their continued silence about what they'd learned during their time at the estate. Sebastian stood up, signaling that the formal presentation was over. I understand that this is a lot to process, Lorraine. Take some time to think about it. But remember that this opportunity won't be available indefinitely. The operations we're involved in move quickly, and we need people who can move with them. David gathered his materials and prepared to leave, but paused at the door. One more thing, Ms. Wood. Regardless of your decision, I trust you understand the importance of keeping this conversation confidential. There are people whose safety and livelihood depend on the discretion of everyone involved in our operations. After they left, I sat alone in my office, staring at my computer screen without seeing it. The work I'd been doing for the past week, the press releases and communication strategies I'd been so proud of, suddenly felt different. Every word I'd written, every message I'd crafted, had been part of elaborate deception designed to hide criminal activities behind a veneer of legitimate business. But even as I struggled with the ethical implications of what I'd learned, I couldn't ignore the practical realities of my situation. I was living in Sebastian's house, working for his company, dependent on his continued goodwill for my basic survival. Even if I wanted to walk away, I wasn't sure I had the resources or the options to do so safely. I spent the rest of the day going through the motions of normal work, drafting social media content and reviewing client communications, but my heart wasn't in it. Every task felt tainted by the knowledge of what it was really designed to accomplish. Every project part of a larger deception that I was now consciously participating in. That evening, I skipped dinner and went directly to my suite, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely fabricated. I needed time to think, to weigh my options, to figure out how I'd ended up in a situation where every choice seemed to lead to a different kind of compromise. I was standing at my window, watching the lights of Portland twinkle in the distance, when there was a soft knock at my door. I opened it to find Sebastian standing in the hallway, holding a bottle of wine and wearing an expression that managed to be both apologetic and determined. "May I come in?" he asked. "I thought you might want to talk." I stepped aside to let him enter, and he moved to the sitting area of my suite, with the easy familiarity of someone who owned everything around him. He opened the wine with practiced efficiency and poured 2 glasses, handing one to me before settling into one of the armchairs. "You're upset," he said. "It wasn't a question. Wouldn't you be? Finding out that your entire life has been manipulated by people you trusted?" Sebastian sipped his wine thoughtfully. "I suppose I would. But I hope you'll consider the alternative perspective. Which is that we've given you opportunities that would never have been available otherwise. That we've recognized your potential and offered you a chance to use it in ways that most people never could." I sat down across from him, cradling my wine glass but not drinking. "By asking me to help you commit corporate espionage, by asking you to help us gather information that serves important purposes. The companies we target aren't innocent victims, Lorraine. They're major corporations with their own intelligence operations, their own unethical practices. What we do levels the playing field. For who? For smaller companies that can't afford their own intelligence operations. For government agencies that need to monitor potential threats. For investors who deserve to know the truth about the companies they're funding." Sebastian's voice took on that evangelical quality again. "We're not destroying information, we're redistributing it. We're making sure that knowledge flows to the people who can use it to make better decisions." It was a seductive argument, wrapped in the language of social justice and market equity. But I could see the flaws in his reasoning, the self-serving assumptions that allowed him to justify activities that were fundamentally criminal. "And you get rich in the process," I pointed out. Sebastian smiled, acknowledging the accuracy of my observation. "Yes, we do. But wealth without purpose is meaningless. What we do here, the operations we run, they have real impact on the world. We're not just making money, we're shaping the flow of information that determines how power is distributed in modern society. And I'm supposed to help you do that by writing press releases? You're supposed to help us do that by ensuring our operations remain hidden from people who would try to stop us for the wrong reasons. The work we do is necessary, Lorraine, but it's also vulnerable to misunderstanding by people who don't see the bigger picture." I took a sip of wine, surprised by its quality and complexity. Everything in Sebastian's world was like that, sophisticated and expensive, and designed to make you forget about the moral compromises required to obtain it. "What about the federal investigators David mentioned? Are they the wrong kind of people? Sebastian's expression darkened slightly. Some of them are. There are people in government who benefit from the current system of information inequality, who profit from keeping certain knowledge restricted to a privileged few. They would shut down operations like ours not because they're illegal, but because they threaten established power structures. And the others? The others are simply doing their jobs, following protocols that weren't designed for the modern information economy. They're not evil, but they're not necessarily right either. I set down my wine glass and looked directly at Sebastian. I need to know something. When you recruited me, when you had Victoria Sterling call me with this job offer, did you know that I would end up in this situation? Did you plan to make me an accessory to your operations? Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him weighing how much truth to reveal. We hoped you would choose to work with us voluntarily, he said finally. But we also knew that circumstances might require us to be more direct about the nature of our operations. So yes, this was always the plan. This was always a possibility. We needed someone with your skills, and we were prepared to offer significant incentives to ensure your cooperation. Including threats? Including honest assessments of the consequences of various choices. Sebastian leaned forward, his blue eyes intense. I won't lie to you, Lorraine. Walking away from this situation would be complicated for everyone involved. But it's not impossible, and it's not necessarily dangerous if handled correctly. What does handling it correctly mean? It means accepting certain restrictions on your future activities, agreeing to periodic contact to ensure your continued discretion, and understanding that your knowledge of our operations creates ongoing obligations. I felt a chill run down my spine. Ongoing obligations? Nothing onerous. Occasional meetings to confirm that you're not experiencing financial difficulties that might create temptations to monetize your knowledge. Periodic reviews of your employment situation to ensure you're not in positions where you might inadvertently compromise our operations. Basic security measures that protect everyone involved. It sounded like a lifetime of surveillance disguised as benevolent interest. They would never really let me go, never stop watching and checking, and making sure I remained compliant with their needs. And if I agree to work with you? Sebastian's expression brightened immediately. Then you become part of something extraordinary. You'll have access to resources and opportunities that most people can't imagine. You'll be financially secure for the rest of your life, and you'll be contributing to operations that have real impact on the world. He reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope, which he placed on the table between us. This is a contract that outlines the terms of full partnership in our operations. The compensation is significantly higher than what we initially discussed, and the benefits are comprehensive. I opened the envelope and scanned the document inside. The salary figures were indeed higher, almost absurdly so. But the contract also contained clauses about confidentiality, exclusivity, and performance expectations that made it clear this would be a total commitment, not just a job. How long do I have to decide? We'll need an answer by tomorrow evening. We have operations launching next week that will require either your full participation or your complete separation from our activities. Sebastian finished his wine and stood up, but paused at the door. I hope you'll choose to stay, Lorraine. Not just because we need your skills, but because I believe you'd thrive in this environment. You have instincts for this kind of work that can't be taught, only developed. After he left, I sat alone with the contract and my wine, trying to understand how I'd ended up in this impossible situation. 3 weeks ago, I'd been a struggling marketing coordinator worried about making rent. Now I was being offered a partnership in what amounted to a sophisticated criminal enterprise, with compensation that would solve every financial problem I'd ever had. The rational part of my mind cataloged all the reasons to refuse. The work was illegal, dangerous, and morally questionable. The people involved were manipulative and potentially ruthless. The future consequences of getting caught could include prison time and the destruction of any legitimate career prospects. But another part of my mind, the part that had been shaped by years of financial stress and professional disappointment, was calculating what those salary figures could mean. No more worrying about rent or student loans. No more choosing between groceries and healthcare. No more feeling like I was constantly one crisis away from catastrophe. I thought about my grandmother, who had worked 3 jobs to put me through college, who had died still owing money on credit cards she'd used to help me succeed. What would she think about the choice I was facing? Would she understand the temptation, or would she be horrified by the moral compromises I was considering? I spent most of the night walking around my suite reading and rereading the contract, trying to find some angle or perspective that would make the decision clear. But every argument led to counter-arguments. Every moral principle conflicted with practical necessities. As dawn broke over the Portland skyline, I realized that I had already made my choice, perhaps had been making it since the moment I'd signed the confidentiality agreement in the Heathman Hotel. I was too invested in this life, too dependent on the security and opportunities it provided, to walk away voluntarily. But I also realized that my decision wouldn't be based solely on fear or greed. Sebastian had been right about one thing. I did have instincts for this kind of work. The strategic thinking, the careful balance of truth and deception, the ability to see patterns and opportunities that others missed. For the first time in my career, I was being offered a chance to use my skills in ways that felt genuinely challenging and meaningful. The morality of it was complex, but then again, so was the morality of the corporate world I'd been working in before. At least here, the deceptions and manipulations were honest about what they were. At least here, I would be compensated appropriately for my contributions to morally ambiguous activities. I showered and dressed carefully that morning, choosing an outfit that projected confidence and competence. When I knocked on Sebastian's office door at 9 o'clock, I was carrying the signed contract and a proposal for how to restructure our communications strategy to better support the intelligence operations he'd described. "I'm in," I said simply, handing him the documents. Sebastian smiled, but there was something almost sad in his expression, as if my agreement represented both a victory and a loss. "Welcome to the real Ashford Technologies, Lorraine. I think you're going to find it much more interesting than the version you thought you were working for." Over the next several weeks, my education in the true nature of Sebastian's operations began in earnest. I learned about the software tools they used to penetrate corporate networks, the social engineering techniques that convinced employees to reveal sensitive information, and the complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts that disguised the flow of money and data between clients and targets. My role evolved from simple communications management to strategic planning for intelligence operations. I helped design cover stories for penetration attempts, crafted communications that would deflect suspicion from anomalous network activity, and developed profiles of target companies that identified their vulnerabilities and potential access points. The work was challenging and intellectually stimulating in ways that my previous job had never been. I found myself working 12 and 14-hour days not because I was required to, but because I was genuinely fascinated by the complexity of the operations we were planning and executing. Sebastian proved to be an excellent mentor, sharing not just the technical aspects of intelligence work, but the psychological and strategic principles that made it effective. He taught me to think like the people we were targeting, to understand their motivations and blind spots, to predict their responses to various stimuli. The key to effective intelligence work, he told me one evening, as we reviewed plans for an operation targeting a major aerospace company, is understanding that people are fundamentally predictable. They make decisions based on patterns that can be identified and exploited. Even people who are trained to recognize manipulation, especially those people, they're often so focused on detecting obvious deceptions that they miss subtle ones. They're so confident in their ability to spot threats that they become overconfident and careless. I was learning to think the same way, to see vulnerabilities where others saw strengths, to identify opportunities in situations that seemed secure. It was a skill set that felt both powerful and dangerous, like learning to see the world through a predator's eyes. The financial rewards were as substantial as Sebastian had promised. My first quarterly bonus was larger than my entire annual salary at Brennan Associates, and I began to understand how people became addicted to this kind of work. The money wasn't just compensation, it was validation, proof that my contributions were valuable and appreciated. But the most surprising aspect of my new life was my relationship with Sebastian himself. What had started as a professional arrangement gradually developed into something more complex and intimate. We spent long hours working together, sharing meals and conversations that ranged far beyond business topics. I began to see beyond his carefully controlled exterior to the brilliant, driven, and occasionally vulnerable man underneath. Sebastian was a master manipulator, but he was also genuinely passionate about the work we were doing. He believed deeply in the importance of information freedom, in the idea that knowledge should flow to the people who could use it most effectively, rather than being hoarded by powerful institutions. His arguments were seductive not just because they served his interests, but because they contained enough truth to be genuinely compelling. I found myself falling under his influence in ways that went beyond simple professional admiration. Sebastian had a way of making me feel like I was part of something important, something that mattered in ways that transcended ordinary business success. When he praised my work or sought my opinion on strategic questions, I felt a rush of pride and satisfaction that was almost intoxicating. It wasn't until I'd been working with the real Ashford Technologies for nearly 2 months that I began to understand the full scope of what I'd committed to and the real nature of the man I was working for. The revelation came during a meeting with a new client, a woman named Catherine Pierce, who represented what she described as stakeholders in a major technology acquisition. She wanted intelligence about the target company's financial situation, their upcoming product launches, and their internal decision-making processes. The meeting took place in Sebastian's office on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Catherine Pierce was probably in her 40s, with the kind of polished appearance that suggested serious money and serious connections. She spoke in the careful language of someone accustomed to conducting sensitive business, and she asked exactly the right questions about our capabilities and discretion. But something about her presence made me uncomfortable in ways I couldn't initially identify. There was an intensity about her attention, a way of watching Sebastian that seemed almost proprietary. When she looked at me, I felt evaluated and catalogued, as if she were determining my value and potential threat level. The meeting lasted about an hour, with Sebastian and Catherine discussing technical details and operational timelines. I took notes and asked appropriate questions, playing my role as the communications consultant while privately wondering what kind of, concerned stakeholders required this level of intelligence about a technology acquisition. After Catherine left, I expected Sebastian to debrief about the meeting, to discuss implementation strategies and potential complications. Instead, he seemed distracted and tense, pacing around his office like a caged animal. "Is everything all right?" I asked. Sebastian stopped pacing and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something that might have been regret or resignation. "There are aspects of this business that I haven't fully explained to you," he said. "Clients like Catherine represent challenges that go beyond simple intelligence gathering." "What kind of challenges?" "The kind that require careful management of competing interests and conflicting loyalties." Sebastian moved to his desk and opened a secure drawer, withdrawing a file that he placed in front of me. "Catherine Pierce works for a consortium of investors who specialize in hostile acquisitions. They use intelligence to identify weaknesses in target companies, then exploit those weaknesses to force mergers or sales at below-market prices." I opened the file and found detailed profiles of several major technology companies, including financial projections, executive assessments, and what appeared to be blackmail material on key decision-makers. It was a comprehensive toolkit for corporate warfare, far more aggressive and malicious than anything I'd imagined our operations involved. "This is what we do for them?" I asked. "This is what we've done for them. Multiple times. Catherine's consortium has acquired 7 major companies over the past 3 years, using intelligence we provided to execute hostile takeovers that displaced thousands of employees and destroyed billions of dollars in shareholder value." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "And you're okay with that?" Sebastian sat down heavily in his chair, suddenly looking older than his years. "I'm not sure okay is the right word, but it's profitable. And it's the kind of client relationship that provides the resources for other operations that serve better purposes." "What other operations?" "We've helped government agencies identify terrorist financing networks. We've provided intelligence that prevented industrial espionage by foreign governments. We've exposed corporate fraud that saved pension funds billions of dollars." Sebastian's voice took on a defensive quality, The work we do for clients like Catherine funds work that actually makes the world a better place. It was a utilitarian argument, the idea that evil means could be justified by good ends. But as I looked at the files spread across Sebastian's desk, detailed plans for destroying companies and ruining lives, I felt the moral foundation of my participation in his operations begin to crack. How many other clients like Catherine are there? I asked. Sebastian was quiet for a long moment. Enough to keep the operation funded, he said finally. Not all of our clients are altruistic, Lorraine. Some of them are simply powerful people who want to be more powerful, or wealthy people who want to be wealthier. But their money allows us to take on projects that serve better purposes. And I'm supposed to help you provide services to people who destroy companies for profit? You're supposed to help me maintain the cover that allows us to serve all of our clients, regardless of their motivations. It's a package deal, unfortunately. You can't choose to support only the operations you find morally acceptable. I stood up and walked to the window, trying to process the implications of what Sebastian was telling me. I'd known that the work was legally questionable, but I'd convinced myself that it served legitimate purposes, that we were leveling the playing field rather than tilting it toward whoever could afford our services. What if I can't do this? I asked. What if I can't help clients like Catherine destroy innocent companies? Sebastian joined me at the window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. Then we'll need to discuss alternative arrangements, he said quietly. But I hope you'll consider the full context before making any final decisions. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of my beautiful suite, trying to reconcile the man I'd been falling for with the scope of the operations he was running. Sebastian wasn't just a corporate spy with idealistic motivations. He was the leader of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that served whoever could afford their services, regardless of the human cost of their objectives. But I also couldn't ignore the other aspects of what I'd learned about his operations. The intelligence provided to government agencies, the corporate fraud investigations, the work that genuinely served public interests. Sebastian had been right about one thing. It was a package deal. The good and the bad were inextricably linked, funded by the same clients and executed by the same systems. The question I faced was whether I could live with the moral compromises required to be part of something that did both tremendous good and terrible harm. Whether I could accept responsibility for the destructive operations in exchange for the opportunity to contribute to the constructive ones. As dawn broke over Portland once again, I realized that I'd already answered that question by staying as long as I had. By allowing myself to become so deeply embedded in Sebastian's world that extraction would be nearly impossible. I was no longer just an employee or a consultant. I was a partner, complicit in everything Ashford Technologies did, responsible for both its successes and its failures. The only question now was whether I could find a way to influence the direction of our operations, to steer them toward the kinds of clients and projects that aligned with my own moral compass. Sebastian had recruited me not just for my communication skills but for my instincts and judgment. Perhaps I could use those qualities to help him see that serving clients like Catherine Pierce wasn't just morally questionable, but strategically dangerous. It was a risky strategy, one that could easily backfire if Sebastian interpreted my concerns as disloyalty or weakness. But it was also the only path I could see that allowed me to remain in his world, while preserving some sense of ethical integrity. That morning, I prepared a detailed analysis of our client relationships, including risk assessments and recommendations for shifting our focus toward more defensible operations. It was a proposal for transforming Ashford Technologies from a mercenary intelligence service into something that could genuinely claim to serve the public interest. Whether Sebastian would accept my recommendations remained to be seen. But, for the first time since I'd signed his contract, I felt like I had a plan that might allow me to sleep peacefully in the beautiful prison I'd chosen for myself. When I presented my analysis to Sebastian the following morning, I expected resistance, skepticism, perhaps even anger. Instead, he read through my recommendations with the same careful attention he gave to operational intelligence, making notes in the margins, and asking clarifying questions that suggested genuine interest, rather than polite dismissal. "This is ambitious," he said finally, setting down the document and leaning back in his chair. "You're essentially proposing that we transform the fundamental business model that's made Ashford Technologies successful." "I'm proposing that we evolve it," I corrected. The skills and resources we've developed can be applied to more defensible objectives without sacrificing profitability or effectiveness. Sebastian stood and moved to his familiar position by the window, hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the city. The clients you want to eliminate represent 60% of our current revenue. How do you propose we replace that income? I'd anticipated this question and had spent hours developing a comprehensive answer. Government contracts, corporate fraud investigations, cybersecurity consulting for legitimate defensive purposes. The same agencies and companies that currently hire us for questionable operations would pay even more for services that carry no legal or reputational risks. Would they, though? The appeal of what we offer isn't just the intelligence itself, but the fact that it's intelligence they couldn't obtain through legitimate channels. We provide access to information that's specifically protected or restricted. We provide access to information that reveals truth, I said. The source of that information matters less than its accuracy and relevance. If we can deliver the same quality of intelligence through legal means, our clients will pay for the reduced risk. Sebastian turned back to face me, his expression thoughtful but unreadable. You're assuming that our clients want reduced risk. Many of them are specifically attracted to services that operate in gray areas, precisely because those services provide competitive advantages that their legitimate competitors can't access. It was a valid point, one that highlighted the fundamental challenge of trying to reform an organization built around providing illicit services. Our clients didn't just want information. They wanted information that their competitors couldn't get, advantages that could only be obtained through questionable means. Then we need different clients, I said. Organizations that value competitive intelligence but want it obtained through legal channels. There's a growing market for that kind of service, especially as regulatory scrutiny of corporate espionage increases. Sebastian returned to his desk and pulled out another file, one I hadn't seen before. Let me show you something that might change your perspective on this situation. The file contained what appeared to be financial projections for Ashford Technologies, but the numbers were far larger than anything I'd seen in our regular business reports. Revenue streams I didn't recognize, expense categories that seemed unrelated to our normal operations, profit margins that defied belief. These are our actual financials, Sebastian explained. The legitimate cybersecurity business that you've been helping to publicize represents about 15% of our total operations. The intelligence work you know about represents another 25%. The remaining 60% comes from activities that I haven't yet discussed with you. I felt that familiar chill settling in my chest again. What kind of activities? Sebastian opened the file to a section labeled Strategic Assets and showed me a list of holdings that included real estate, technology companies, investment funds, and what appeared to be offshore banking operations. The scope was staggering, far beyond anything that could be funded by intelligence consulting alone. We don't just gather information, Lorraine. We use that information to make strategic investments, to acquire undervalued assets, to position ourselves advantageously in markets before other players recognize the opportunities. The intelligence operations are just one component of a much larger enterprise. I studied the financial documents, trying to understand the full scope of what Sebastian was describing. You're using insider information to manipulate markets? We're using superior information to make superior investment decisions. It's not manipulation if the information is accurate and the investments are legitimate. But if the information was obtained illegally, then the investments themselves remain legal, even if their basis might be questionable. It's a distinction that matters both legally and practically. Sebastian closed the file and looked at me with an expression that was both challenging and sympathetic. This is why your proposal to eliminate questionable clients isn't viable, Lorraine. Those clients don't just provide revenue, they provide the intelligence that drives our investment operations. Without access to restricted information, we can't maintain the competitive advantages that generate the majority of our profits. I felt the moral foundation I'd been trying to construct crumbling beneath me again. The scope of Sebastian's operations was far beyond what I'd imagined, involving not just corporate espionage, but systematic market manipulation on a scale that could affect entire industries. How long has this been going on? I asked. About 8 years. I started with traditional cybersecurity consulting, but I quickly realized that the real value wasn't in protecting information, but in accessing it. Each successful intelligence operation provided insights that could be monetized through strategic investments, and each profitable investment provided capital for more sophisticated operations. And now? Now we're one of the most successful privately held investment firms on the West Coast, with a diversified portfolio that generates returns most hedge funds can only dream of. The intelligence operations aren't just profitable in themselves, they're the foundation for everything else we do. I walked to the window and stared out at the city, trying to process the implications of what Sebastian had revealed. I'd thought I was being recruited to help with corporate espionage, morally questionable but understandable in the context of competitive business intelligence. Instead, I'd become part of a systematic operation to manipulate financial markets using illegally obtained information. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because you've proven yourself valuable enough to be trusted with the complete picture. And because the proposal you've developed demonstrates the kind of strategic thinking that could help us expand into new areas of operation. Sebastian joined me at the window, standing close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence. I'm not asking you to abandon your ethical concerns, Lorraine. I'm asking you to consider whether those concerns might be applied more effectively from within our organization than from outside it. What do you mean? You've identified legitimate opportunities for applying our capabilities to defensible purposes. What if we pursue those opportunities not as replacements for our current operations, but as additions to them? What if we use the profits from questionable activities to fund operations that serve unquestionably good purposes? It was the same utilitarian argument he'd made before, but with an added dimension that made it more compelling. Instead of just balancing good and bad clients, he was proposing to use profits from bad clients to fund genuinely beneficial operations that couldn't be profitable on their own. You're talking about using dirty money to do clean work, I said. I'm talking about using available resources to maximize positive impact. The money we generate from morally ambiguous operations is still money that can be used to serve legitimate purposes. The question is whether you'd rather see those resources applied constructively or left to serve only narrow commercial interests. Over the next several hours, Sebastian walked me through detailed proposals for expanding our operations into areas that aligned with my ethical concerns. Cybersecurity services for nonprofit organizations, pro bono intelligence work for government agencies investigating corruption, research and development of defensive technologies that could protect smaller companies from the kind of aggressive tactics used by clients like Catherine Pierce. The proposals were sophisticated and well-developed, clearly the result of considerable planning and analysis. They also represented a genuine attempt to address my concerns, while maintaining the operational framework that made Ashford Technologies profitable. These would be real operations? I asked. Not just public relations exercises designed to provide cover for questionable activities? They would be real operations with real budgets and real impact, Sebastian assured me. The only difference is that they would be funded by profits from less defensible activities rather than being expected to generate profits themselves. And I would have authority over these operations? Real decision-making power rather than just communications management? Sebastian smiled, the first genuinely warm expression I'd seen from him all day. You would have complete authority over the ethical operations division, with your own budget, your own staff, and your own operational objectives. Think of it as your opportunity to build the kind of organization you believe we should be. The offer was seductive in ways that went beyond simple professional advancement. Sebastian was proposing to give me the resources and authority to create something genuinely beneficial, to use the skills I'd developed in service of objectives I could believe in, without reservation. But he was also asking me to accept complicity in the questionable operations that would fund my ethical initiatives, to become a willing participant in market manipulation and corporate espionage, in exchange for the opportunity to do some good with the proceeds. I need time to think about this, I said. Of course. But while you're thinking, consider this. The operations I've described will continue with or without your participation. The question isn't whether questionable activities will be conducted. It's whether the profits from those activities will be used constructively or simply accumulated for personal benefit. That evening, I found myself walking the estate grounds again, following the trails that wound through the forest surrounding Sebastian's property. The hidden facility was still there, its lights glowing through the trees, like a beacon of technological sophistication. But now I understood what those lights represented. Not just intelligence gathering, but the nerve center of a financial empire built on information asymmetries and market manipulation. As I walked, I tried to imagine what my life would look like if I accepted Sebastian's proposal. I would have the resources to build cybersecurity programs for organizations that couldn't afford them, to investigate corporate fraud that government agencies lacked the resources to pursue, to develop defensive technologies that could protect smaller companies from aggressive acquisition tactics. But I would also be knowingly participating in the systematic violation of securities laws, the manipulation of markets that affected pension funds and individual investors, and the kind of corporate espionage that could destroy companies and eliminate jobs. The moral calculation was impossibly complex, involving competing obligations and conflicting values that couldn't be easily reconciled. Was it ethical to participate in harmful activities if the profits were used for beneficial purposes? Could good ends justify evil means? Or did the means inevitably corrupt the ends they were supposed to serve? I thought about my grandmother, who had worked multiple jobs to support my education, who had believed deeply in the importance of honest work and ethical behavior. What would she think of the choice I was facing? Would she understand the pragmatic calculations that made Sebastian's offer attractive? Or would she be horrified by my willingness to compromise fundamental principles for financial security and professional advancement? As I stood in the clearing where I could see both the main house and the hidden facility, I realized that my decision wouldn't be based solely on abstract ethical principles. It would be based on my assessment of Sebastian himself, on whether I believed his commitment to using questionable profits for beneficial purposes was genuine, or simply another layer of manipulation designed to secure my cooperation. Over the months I'd been working with him, I'd seen Sebastian demonstrate genuine passion for certain types of operations, real excitement about projects that served public interests rather than just commercial ones. His enthusiasm for the defensive cybersecurity work seemed authentic, as did his interest in using our capabilities to investigate corporate fraud and corruption. But I'd also seen his ruthless efficiency in dealing with threats to his operations, his willingness to manipulate and coerce when persuasion proved insufficient. Sebastian was capable of genuine idealism, but he was also capable of treating people as assets to be managed, rather than individuals with their own agency and dignity. The question was which aspect of his character would ultimately determine how our partnership developed. Would he honor his commitment to funding ethical operations, or would the demands of maintaining profitability eventually override his better intentions? When I returned to the house that night, I found Sebastian waiting in the library with a bottle of wine and a chess set arranged on the table between two chairs. It was an unexpected gesture, intimate and relaxed in a way that contrasted sharply with the intensity of our earlier conversation. "Do you play?" he asked, gesturing to the chessboard. "Not well, but I know the rules." That's all anyone knows, really. The rest is just pattern recognition and strategic thinking. We played in comfortable silence for a while, with Sebastian demonstrating the kind of tactical sophistication I'd expected while I struggled to avoid obvious blunders. But as the game progressed, I began to see deeper patterns in his play, strategies that revealed as much about his personality as they did about his chess skills. Sebastian played aggressively but not recklessly, taking calculated risks that put pressure on my position while maintaining strong defensive foundations. He was willing to sacrifice pieces to gain positional advantages, but only when the sacrifices served larger strategic objectives. Most tellingly, he seemed to genuinely enjoy the intellectual challenge of the game, even when my inexperience made the outcome inevitable. "You're learning quickly," he said as I managed to avoid a trap that would have cost me my queen. "Most people become predictable once they fall behind, but you're still looking for creative solutions. I don't like giving up. Neither do I. It's one of the qualities that's made our partnership successful." Sebastian captured one of my bishops but left his own king in a slightly vulnerable position, a move that seemed designed to test whether I would recognize and exploit the opportunity. "Tell me about your grandmother," he said as I studied the board. The request seemed to come from nowhere, but I'd learned to be suspicious of Sebastian's casual-seeming questions. "Why do you want to know about her?" "Because you've mentioned her several times, always in the context of ethical guidance or moral authority. She seems to have been important in shaping your values." I moved my rook to attack his exposed king, forcing him to castle earlier than he'd probably intended. She was. She believed in working hard, being honest, and taking care of the people you love. Simple principles, but she lived by them consistently. And what do you think she would say about the choice you're facing now? Sebastian's king was safe, but my aggressive move had opened up my own position to counterattack. I realized that his apparently vulnerable position had been bait, designed to lure me into overextending my pieces. She would probably tell me to find a way to do the right thing without compromising my integrity, I said. But she lived in a simpler world than this one. The choices available to her were clearer than the ones I'm facing. Were they, though? Or did she just make decisions based on principles rather than outcomes? Sebastian advanced his queen to a position that threatened multiple pieces simultaneously, a move that demonstrated both tactical brilliance and strategic patience. Your grandmother worked multiple jobs to support your education, which meant she had less time for other activities, other relationships, other priorities. She made sacrifices that affected other areas of her life in order to achieve a specific objective. How is that different from what I'm proposing? The difference is that her sacrifices were personal. She didn't ask other people to pay the cost of her decisions. Didn't she? What about the employers who might have benefited from her full attention if she hadn't been working multiple jobs? What about the community organization she might have supported if she'd had more time and energy? What about her own well-being, which might have been better if she'd made different choices? I moved my queen to block his attack, but I could see that my position was deteriorating rapidly. Sebastian's systematic pressure was creating problems faster than I could solve them. You're arguing that all choices involve moral compromises, I said. I'm arguing that all significant choices involve trade-offs that affect other people in ways we can't fully control or predict. The question isn't whether our decisions will have negative consequences. It's whether those consequences are outweighed by positive ones. Sebastian captured my queen with a move I hadn't seen coming, effectively ending the game even though several pieces remained on the board. The difference between your grandmother's choices and mine isn't the presence or absence of moral compromise. It's the scale and complexity of the calculations involved. I studied the board, looking for some continuation that might salvage my position, but the game was clearly over. Sebastian had demonstrated superior tactical skill, but he'd also revealed something about his worldview that helped me understand his approach to the larger game we were playing. You see everything as a chess match, I said. Moves and countermoves, sacrifices and advantages, all in service of strategic objectives. I see everything as a complex system where individual decisions create ripple effects that extend far beyond their immediate context, Sebastian corrected. The chess metaphor is useful because it emphasizes the importance of thinking several moves ahead, but it's imperfect because real life involves far more variables and far less predictable outcomes. He began resetting the pieces for another game, his movements efficient and practiced. The question you're facing isn't whether to participate in a chess match, Lorraine. You're already participating, whether you recognize it or not. The question is whether you want to be a conscious player or an unconscious pawn. That night I dreamed about chessboards that stretched to the horizon, with pieces that moved according to rules I couldn't understand and strategies I couldn't predict. When I woke, I realized that Sebastian's metaphor had captured something essential about my situation. I was already part of a game much larger than I'd initially understood, and my only real choice was how actively and consciously to participate in it. The next morning, I prepared a detailed response to Sebastian's proposal, outlining my conditions for accepting expanded responsibilities within Ashford Technologies. I wanted specific guarantees about funding for ethical operations, clear authority over hiring and operational decisions for my division, and regular reviews to ensure that beneficial activities were receiving adequate resources and attention. I also requested transparency about the full scope of our questionable operations, arguing that I couldn't make informed decisions about complicity without understanding exactly what I was being asked to be complicit in. If I was going to accept responsibility for the organization's overall impact, I needed complete information about its activities. When I presented my response to Sebastian, he read through it with the same careful attention he'd given to my initial reform proposal. But this time his expression was more difficult to read, suggesting calculations and considerations that I couldn't identify. "These are reasonable requests," he said finally, "but they would require significant changes to our operational structure and information security protocols. Are you certain you want this level of involvement and responsibility?" "I'm certain that I can't make an informed decision without it. And I'm certain that any partnership we develop needs to be based on mutual trust and shared information, rather than selective disclosure and careful manipulation." Sebastian smiled, but there was something almost sad in his expression. "You're asking me to treat you as an equal partner rather than a valuable employee. That's a significant shift in our relationship. It's the only kind of relationship that would allow me to stay here with a clear conscience. I can't be responsible for outcomes I'm not allowed to influence or accountable for decisions I'm not allowed to participate in making." Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against his desk in the familiar pattern I'd learned to recognize as a sign of intense mental calculation. "This would make you a target," he said finally. "Not just of law enforcement if our operations are ever discovered, but of competitors who might see you as a vulnerability to be exploited. Are you prepared for that level of risk? I'm already a target by virtue of working here and knowing what I know. The question is whether I'm a conscious target who can help manage the risks, or an unconscious one who might inadvertently create them." Sebastian nodded slowly, as if my answer had confirmed something he'd been hoping to hear. "Very well. We'll restructure our operations to accommodate your requirements. But I want you to understand that this decision is irreversible. Once you have access to complete information about our activities, there's no going back to a position of plausible deniability. I understand. And you accept the risks that come with equal partnership in an organization that operates in legal and ethical gray areas?" I thought about my grandmother, about the simple principles she'd tried to teach me, about the complex world I was choosing to engage with rather than escape from. I accept the responsibility that comes with having the resources and authority to influence those gray areas in positive directions. Sebastian stood and extended his hand across his desk. "Welcome to full partnership in Ashford Technologies, Lorraine. I think you're going to find it both more challenging and more rewarding than anything you've experienced before." As I shook his hand, I realized that I was crossing a threshold from which there truly was no return. I was no longer someone who had stumbled into Sebastian's world through desperation and circumstance. I was someone who had chosen to embrace that world with full knowledge of its complexities and contradictions. The moral calculations hadn't become any clearer, and the ethical dilemmas hadn't been resolved. But I decided that engaging with those challenges from a position of knowledge and authority was preferable to either fleeing from them or remaining ignorant of their full scope. Over the following months, I built the Ethical Operations Division into everything Sebastian had promised and more. We developed cybersecurity programs for dozens of nonprofit organizations, investigated corporate fraud cases that resulted in significant prosecutions, and created defensive technologies that helped smaller companies protect themselves from aggressive acquisition tactics. The work was deeply satisfying in ways that my previous career had never been, challenging my skills while serving purposes I believed in without reservation. I had the resources to pursue complex projects, the authority to make strategic decisions, and the satisfaction of seeing tangible positive results from my efforts. But I also became fully aware of the questionable operations that funded my beneficial activities. I sat in on planning meetings for intelligence operations targeting companies whose only crime was possessing information that our clients wanted. I reviewed financial reports that detailed profits from market manipulation schemes. I participated in strategic discussions about expanding into new areas of corporate espionage. The knowledge was sometimes difficult to bear, but it also allowed me to influence decisions in ways that minimized harm and maximized benefit. I couldn't prevent all questionable activities, but I could ensure that they were conducted with greater care for collateral damage, and that their profits were directed toward constructive purposes. My relationship with Sebastian evolved as well, developing from professional partnership into something more personal and complex. We spent long evenings discussing philosophy and strategy, sharing meals and conversations that ranged far beyond business topics. I began to understand the loneliness that came with his position, the isolation that resulted from being responsible for operations that couldn't be discussed with anyone outside a very small circle of trusted associates. Sebastian was a fascinating and frustrating man, capable of genuine warmth and ruthless calculation, often within the same conversation. He was intellectually brilliant and morally flexible, idealistic about certain principles and pragmatic about their application. Living and working so closely with him required constant recalibration of my own ethical framework, constant negotiation between competing values and conflicting loyalties. But it also provided opportunities for growth and impact that I couldn't have imagined in my previous life. The resources available through Ashford Technologies allowed me to pursue projects that could affect thousands of people, to develop capabilities that served important purposes, to contribute to operations that genuinely made the world more secure and more just. As I sat in my office one evening, reviewing reports from our various divisions, I realized that I'd become exactly what Sebastian had promised I could be: a conscious participant in a complex game, rather than an unconscious pawn. The game itself remained morally ambiguous, involving activities I couldn't fully endorse, and serving clients whose motivations I sometimes questioned. But my participation allowed me to influence outcomes in positive directions, to ensure that questionable profits served beneficial purposes, and to build something valuable within a framework that might otherwise serve only narrow commercial interests. It wasn't the simple ethical clarity that my grandmother might have preferred, but it was a form of moral engagement that felt appropriate to the complex world I'd chosen to inhabit. I was no longer invisible in Sebastian's operations. I was a full partner in shaping their direction and impact. And for the first time since I'd lost my job at Brennan Associates, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.